Hello, everybody. We are here this afternoon to talk grid resilience, really, with Loic Hares and me, Jane Skuse. This is the 7th instalment of our series about renewable energy, resilient futures. And we're going to be focusing on the Texas power grid disaster, which affected huge swathes of people in Texas, leaving them without heating, without power for a long period of time in an unexpected freeze, really, but we'll talk more about that. And in fact, how afterwards it was blamed on renewable energy, which, again, we'll discuss whether or not that had an impact on the resilience of their grid and really quite what happened. So I'm going to hand over to Loic, who might be able to give you a bit of a background on the Texas outage and quite what happened and what caused it, because it was from what I understand, Loic, it's an unexpected combination of factors that people never expected all to happen at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a bit of a trifecta, but
that's right. Yeah, that's a good word.
The power system in Texas is quite an interesting network in itself, because it's actually run as a completely separate grid to all of the other states surrounding it. So yeah, it has, the UK as a country has interconnectors with across the sea to France, but also to other European countries. So even us as an island, we have interconnection with different grids, whereas the Texas grid is actually completely self-contained. It's its own little power island, which makes it quite unique in the way it's run.
Yeah.
So yeah, so they had a few things that happened in February, which kind of contributed to the massive power outages, which affected so many million people in one go. The first of which is, the temperature was really quite different to what was forecast, and that's the key bit. It's not, but it was very cold. It was very cold, and it wasn't forecast. So it was minus.
So in kind of grid, you can, if you know what's coming, presumably you can make sure that demand's going to be covered, or you can do your best to.
So all grid management companies like National Grid that manage our grid in the UK have different mechanisms they can use to better manage situations where the temperature changes quite considerably. So in the UK in January, we had 3 days where our kind of spot price on the wholesale market went through the roof, and it hit a kind of maximum of £1,500 per megawatt hour.
Wow.
And that was because it was unseasonably cold, and National Grid had to use some of the mechanisms that they have in place to manage those situations. So they use standby generation and other mechanisms to be able to control the situation. Here in Texas, they had a few issues to be able to do that. Firstly, it was minus 9 degrees on February the 15th, which is 25 degrees centigrade less than the kind of average temperature in that state.
Yeah, I know, it was a real blip, wasn't it? It happens, but it doesn't happen that much.
And in Texas, 60% of the Texans use electricity to heat themselves, because all of the houses have air conditioners, which can be used to heat as well as cool. But they normally don't have the requirements to heat their houses. So the minus 9 degrees temperatures caused everybody to crank on their heaters, which made a massive peak in demand. And that the peak in demand made prices hit up to $9,000 per megawatt hour. So our peak in demand over the winter went up to about £1,500 per megawatt hours. Theirs went to $9,000 per.
Because they can't pull in energy from outside of Texas, because they're mainly within the state.
So then the other two things happened alongside the massive low temperatures they had. So Texas has a quite interesting split in generation between coal, nuclear, natural gas, and then renewable energies. So renewable energies actually just make up only quite a small percentage of the generation. I think it's 25% wind and less than a percentage solar on the grid. Mainly, they generate electricity from natural gas and coal. So the issue when everybody switched on their heaters on the 15th of February was that the natural gas production across Texas, but also America, was completely hit by the cold weather. So they weren't producing any natural gas because the plants that they used to actually create the natural gas, the wells and all of that lot, were affected so much by the cold weathers, but they had to shut them down.
Is that because there's water involved in the process, isn't it? And it all froze. That's what I.
That's what I understand.
My lady.
Yeah,
that's kind of honest,
yeah.
They all froze up.
Yeah, they all froze up, and 20% of gas production was cut. There was also some issues at the time with supply from Mexico because of the cold weather, and all of these different factors kind of came together that meant that all of the gas-fired power stations had to, weren't able to produce as much electricity generation either. Now, further north in America, all of the gas power stations are what they call winterized.
Yes,
so all of their pipes are insulated and everything is prepared for winter.
They're resilient, right? Because they expect that weather.
Yeah.
So there are things in place to stop the pipes freezing and to stop to keep the thing running when it's cold, because they know it's going to be cold.
Exactly in the same way as in the UK, we put insulation around our pipes outside to stop our outside pipes bursting.
Yeah, if it wasn't cold, you wouldn't bother.
Yeah. So in Texas, they don't go through that process of winterizing their gas plants because they've never had the need for it before. So they had that massive cut in natural gas fired power plant production, and then the third thing that happened is that there was unseasonably low amounts of winds in February, so that the 25% generation that comes from wind generation was also quite affected. So they didn't have as much natural gas fired power plant generation, and then they had a massive cut in wind power as well. So those three things kind of came into play in one go, which meant that that they just had to cut demand because their demand was massively outstripping supply. Yeah.
I read a thing that said even the thing that you would have thought would be resilient, which was the coal-fired plants, even they were hit possibly because the piles of coal were frozen.
Yeah.
So so even that you would have thought, well, it's heat. Surely that's okay in the winter.
And their nuclear power plants also had to shut down because they use water to cool the reactors.
Yeah. And
the water supplies froze as well. So no, it was just such a freak scenario that happened all in one go. And because it was just such a freak temperature drop, they just weren't prepared for it in any way. And I think that I've spoken to a few people in the last week preparing for this discussion today, and the main takeaway is that how we differ, our power network differs to the one in Texas is, number one, our network has been built in such a way that there's always a standby for any faults. So if a fault happens in your street, the network has been designed that your street is the substation that supplies power to your street is always supplied from two different supply points. So if one goes down, there's always a failback to a second one. And it's called N-1 resilience. And I'm sure the people I used to work with at UK Power Networks will laugh at me trying to explain N-1 fault detection.
Because that's what they do all day long.
Absolutely. But that's the way our network has been built. And secondly, we've got the interconnectors in place so that if need be, we can bring in power from not only different areas of the UK, we can pass power around, but also we have the interconnectors with Europe, which is a massive help. Secondly, we have because we have different we've got a different climate than in Texas. We've built resilience in the way we manage scenarios like this. So when we had the few days in January where the temperature dropped to below zero, that affected our power generation, and our demand as a nation went through the roof as well, because people were turning on their electric heaters to cope with the cold, and that did cause a surge on our network as well. However, National Grid, what they did was that they were able to call on generators to generate more electricity, and it cost the grid a lot more money, and that's why it drove the prices of energy up. However, we've got huge amounts of standby generation which is able to turn on, so that we have the flexibility to deal with these scenarios. In Texas, they just did not have that flexibility because all of their generation was affected in one go. So when they turned to look at using other generation to cope with failures, they just weren't able to do that because they had failures right across the board.
I think I read as well that they do have massive reserves of natural gas.
Yeah.
But they couldn't access it again because the pipes froze basically, and they couldn't process it out.
So it was a really it's caused a lot of questions across the political fractions in America of was it state failure of how the systems run, and there's a lot of politicians which have come out quite vocally against renewable energy.
That's what happened, wasn't it? Immediately afterwards, renewable energy was blamed as a major factor because the turbines froze, because but obviously it's not that simple. And is it even a factor, the renewableness of the energy?
No,
not by what you've just said.
No, the politicians didn't want to really state that it wasn't the fault of the renewable energy, but the grid fell down. And they didn't want to talk about the reliance on natural gas for their electricity. And you saw a lot of public figures came out and tried to blame the failure on renewable energy. Even kind of somebody from the House of Representatives came out and said, if passed, the Green New Deal will literally kill people. Billions of people have suffered in Texas because of green energy. Increasing the use and banning the export of clean energy is the way forward for America. And it's just incredible that politicians are coming out and having these views when the rest of the world quite readily agree that we're in a climate emergency. That people within Texas politics are coming out and actually trying to blame these failures on the renewable energy sources. And it's just a very different picture to the picture you see across other countries around the world.
Is it just political kind of chucking things around? Is it just or is there any aspect of renewable energy that might lead to people to give any credence to that? I mean, I think there's the fact that it fluctuates is often cited as the reason that it leads to an unstable grid, and that these things are, it just will end in blackouts. And
so I think we've always talked on these resilient futures conversations. We've talked a lot about flexibility and the need for flexibility in future grids and modern grids. And the word flexibility is key here as well. But you can't control renewable energy generation. You can't control winds. So the wind will blow when it blows, and it will generate electricity when it generates electricity. And I think that's where some of the people have come from when they said that it's to blame. But they're worried that if you introduce more and more renewable energy into a grid like Texas, where they don't have the interconnection and be able to switch on to other generation, but it would just cause more blackouts and failures like we've seen. So there's some truth to that, but
in Texas there is some truth to that, really.
Yeah,
I suppose,
absolutely.
because they don't have the checks and balances, and they're not. It's not a resilient grid in that way.
But
Anyway,
when you look at the pipeline of assets which are being built in Texas, there is a huge amount of wind and solar assets, but it's also the state in America which is spending the most money on storage across the whole of America. So
really?
yeah, so I think they know that there's an issue, trying to put in batteries, etc., to cope with that issue. So and today they're only relying on about 26% of generation from renewable energy sources. So it's not really the base generation. So I think it's kind of uncalled for at the moment what the politicians have been saying. However, if they carry on down the line of introducing more and more renewable energies generations without putting the proper checks in place, such as storage and resilience in the network, then it could lead to issues. But it's just amazing the amount of negative impact that this has had on the renewable.
It's been scapegoated quite a lot, hasn't it? I guess though that America has that big political issue with lobbying, with kind of massive financial, the oil industry, for example, pay an awful lot of money to an awful lot of people for their message to get out, and for and green energy doesn't help them, does it really? So I guess there are other factors here. It's not straightforward.
Yeah,
and it's a different political landscape than here to some extent.
Yeah, so we've pretty much closed down the last coal generating power plant in the UK, whereas in Texas they're still generating 20.3% of their electricity from coal power stations.
They've literally just cancelled that one, haven't they, in Cumbria?
Yeah.
It looked as though it was going ahead.
So that's, I think that's it's something to be proud of in the UK, that we've got to the point in our generation that we're not relying on things like coal. However, it's also scary seeing that massive countries like America are still relying so much on coal. And as we look at our road to net zero, you have to kind of question whether we can get to net zero as a world kind of society when there's such reliance on coal generation in other countries.
Yeah, it did certainly underline that, the fact that that you think that even during the Trump era, you think America is a relatively progressive country, and in actual fact, in those terms, it really isn't.
Yeah. Well, we've gone down quite a political.
Should we start? Sorry, that's my fault.
No. I went there as well, but I think that it's a very, very different grid to the one in the UK. And coming back to the question of whether it could happen in the UK, I think that when you look at scenarios where the weather forecast is 25 degrees less than what was expected, it does open up different kind of questions. Whereas in January, when it went to -1, -2, -3 for a few days, that's not massive deviations from the seasonal weather. 25 degrees C, so 25 degrees C deviations is massive. So would we be able to cope with such variations? And I think the answer is yes, we would be able to cope. However, but massive pressure on the bottom lines of energy companies who are supplying electricity at probably a loss over that period of time due to the significantly higher energy costs. So I think that we do have the resilience in our grid. A lot of people think that there still needs to be a huge amount of change to cope with the introduction of more renewable energy and generation and things like electric vehicle charging. However, we're not starting from such a a bad spot as places like Texas, where
Yeah.
you can imagine that if all the Texans, which this is a massive leap of faith to think of Texans ditching their gas guzzling pickup trucks for electric vehicles, but when that happens, or if it happens, you have to question whether the grid there has the resiliency to be able to cope with constantly changing demand as well as fluctuating generation. So that's going to introduce some further questions.
As you say, though, if they've got their eye on storage, I mean, I know from discussions we've had before that it comes down to the quality and the amount of storage that you have that gives the resilience and the ability of renewable energy to give a kind of a constant.
Yeah, I think we're as a company we're biased towards storage because we have got that link to
good
energy.
To admit that, but
yeah, but we do think that it's if to alter the amount of generation from something like a gas power station or a coal power station takes a long lead time because you can't just flick a switch and generate more electricity. Whereas if you've got a large amount of storage on your network, you can literally flick that switch and increase the
waiting.
Yeah,
absolutely. You can use.
And with wind generation, it's not only be able to discharge onto the network, it's be able to soak up some of that extra energy when it doesn't match up to the demand profile. So
yeah, rather than it wasting.
Yeah, and so it gives that kind of flexibility which is needed in the modern grid. So and I know that the US, North America is looking big time at battery storage, and they're leading the way in massive battery projects. But and hopefully the what's happening in Texas will kind of not only it won't go the other way, hopefully, that it won't put such a tarnish on renewable energy, but some of the bigger projects are dropped. Hopefully they'll kind of give some impetus to have more of these kind of projects coming live in the next few years. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you want to go there, but we did say we might talk about the fact that our government has just nominated a huge amount of money for infrastructure, kind of green new infrastructure, I think.
Yep.
Do you think that's enough?
Well, it's a big question. I think it
might be the wrong question as well, I think, but
yeah, it's difficult because going through what we're doing with the pandemic at the moment, you can kind of see why spending a huge amount of money on green infrastructure and green generation is a difficult decision to make at the moment. But I think we've got to keep that target of net zero in mind and start thinking about how we're going to get there. I know that there's a huge amount of research going into electric vehicles and the electrification of transport. But it can't happen on its own. So if we look at these things as a single entities, then that's where issues are going to come from.
Yeah.
So it's we've always talked about on these different discussions about looking at the impact on things across the board. And I think this is one of those areas where it's also needed. I think the government might be relying a little bit too much on offshore wind to get us
that seems to be where a lot of the money's aimed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to tick some boxes, but I would have loved to have seen the scenario where we're incentivized as society to put more solar panels on our roofs and try and reduce our demand at a local level, and reduce our carbon footprints, because it's not only about making our generation green. If you can reduce the demand from the grid and increase self-sustainability and self-consumption at a residential level, then surely that's getting us to the same point, but just in a different way. So I think that, as everything, it's one strategy is not going to crack this nut. It's going to be
it's true.
Looking at it from different aspects and different ways. So And there's a huge amount of people still in the UK who are looking to install solar panels on their roofs, which is absolutely fantastic. I think that it shows that as a nation we're there trying to support the route to net zero. However, again, we've talked about this previously. It tends to be people who can afford to put solar panels on their roofs, who potentially drive a Tesla, and can embrace green living.
Yeah.
We'd love to be able to see green living extended to people who might not be able to afford that green renewable energy. So I think that's where we could probably have seen a bit of space in the budget for a bit more money, and but
at that level rather than infrastructure. But
yeah, we've seen VAT increases on a residential level in the last 2 years for people who are installing solar and battery storage in their homes. It seems like people are almost being punished to put technology in their houses rather than being incentivized. And we've also seen the abolishment of the feed-in tariff over the last 2 years, and that has been replaced by the Smart Export Guarantee. But that Smart Export Guarantee has led to huge issues, especially in the kind of social housing sphere, where it's very difficult for the asset owners, the social housing provider, to actually get hold of the feed-in tariff money, which they need to be able to make the business case for the solar panels in the first place.
Making the business case, that it just won't happen. They're watching every single penny, aren't they? They can't just do it.
So I think we would have liked to have seen a bit more in the budget around making it more not profitable, but helping residential customers make the case for putting solar panels and storage into their houses. But
I guess it could read as a bit of a missed opportunity in terms in that we're all heading for a great return to normal life, hopefully at some point soon, and a lot of the talk has been about going on holiday, suddenly, and they've changes to taxation on travel, which you might suggest goes against any idea of a kind of a holistic reduction in carbon footprint. But it would have been great if they could have led us into this return with a way of reducing our impact. I think. Yeah,
there's a lot of
the impact of this return.
There's a lot of talk from government about the kind of green resurgence and using the green economy to really get us out of where we are at the moment. But working in the green industry myself, I don't really see anything which will, on the ground level, help us do that. So it's it seems I'm yet to see actions to go with the headlines. So I think that probably would have been quite nice to see in the budget. So maybe next budget we'll see that. But
maybe that's what happened. Maybe it's coming. Well, maybe there are ways of doing it ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's always stuff we can do. Isn't there? Yeah. That feels like a natural end to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a good conversation.
It has. It's been great, and I'm glad that we're not heading for long blackouts.
I think that it's a sign of how good our network is. For I can't remember the last blackout I've had at my home. I know that it does happen, and some people do suffer from blackouts in the UK. But when you compare it to stories you hear from around the world, I think we're in quite a fortunate position living in the UK. So I'm going to leave it on a positive note.
Yeah. There we go. I'm gonna just say goodbye then, and we'll see you next month, I think.
So, see you next month.
See you next month.